So we are now going to look at risk management. Basically, we are going to take the company to the doctor. Even if you are, as a human being, feeling okay, the recommendation is that you should visit the doctor at least every 6 months to get a health check, your blood sugar, your cholesterol, and so on and so forth. We don't do it, but we're supposed to do it. And we are going to take the company to a doctor, not every 6 months, but every week, to do a small test on the company. But of course, you know that you and I know that there are some days that we feel really bad, and we have to go to the doctor, and more serious tests are done, like MRIs and CAT scans and so on. And if the results are not very good with those things, the ultimate result may be unfortunately death. So we are going to look at more serious scans of the company to see if there is a possibility of corporate death, which is called corporate collapse. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So all this comes under the area of risk management. So what is the concept of risk? The concept of risk has three elements. The perception that something could happen, the likelihood of something happening, and consequences if it happens. These three are quite different. Now, for example, I do some work with a pharmaceutical company in Australia. They have a chemical called pseudoephedrine, which is used in some cold and flu tablets. It's very powerful, but pseudoephedrine is also the basic ingredients that is used to make the drug ecstasy. Okay, so the value of pseudoephedrine, which is bought officially for the purpose of making pharmaceuticals, is maybe, let us say, $30,000 a container. But if it is stolen, the street value is about $30 million a container. Okay, for the ecstasy. So I asked the chief executive about this pseudoephedrine. Can something happen, like a man takes a truck and drives through your stores and breaks the wall and takes pseudoephedrine? Perception, yes, it could happen. Likelihood, unlikely, but very small likelihood. But if it does happen, the consequences could be the end of the company. Let's take, for example, BP. The perception that one of its underwater cables with all sorts of so-called protection, engineering protection, if something could happen, yes. Likelihood they thought was very small that something would happen, but something did happen, and the consequences we are yet to see. It almost put BP out of business. Okay. So these are the differences between perception, likelihood, and consequence. I saw the news today that the Boeing Dreamliner with the battery problems are now being cleared to fly again. And what they have done is what they call a fail-safe method, that if everything fails, they put it into a box and they have sealed it so that any of the fumes and all cannot get through. But I was just thinking, a plane without a battery, I don't know how good that would be. But anyway, that is their solution. They are expecting that the plane cannot come down. Okay, so there is this difference. Now, all of this is judged by how much of risk that you take pertains to your risk appetite, the level of risk that the entity is prepared to tolerate. Individual and composite risks fall within set acceptable tolerances. So sometimes there is a risk on its own, but sometimes one risk leads to another. This is called the domino effect. So that is the composite risk. Risk acceptance, how much of risk you are willing to take, how much you can transfer to insurance and other things, elimination of risk, avoidance of risk, all that is set by your appetite. So in terms of risk management, there are two clear areas of risk management. Without even knowing it, you have actually done the strategic risk, the risk of planning failure. When I talked about strategic management, I said that there is a new word for risk management, or the old word for risk management. So poor marketing strategy, poor acquisition strategy, unexpected changes in consumer behavior, and political and regulatory change, all that is planning failure. So if you remember, I told you when I looked at the control framework under strategy, I said that implementation is often difficult because changing customer perceptions, new competitors coming in, government regulation, all that, okay, leads to often planning failure. Still we should plan because I told you the value of planning lies in the process of planning. So we have done this. What we are now going to do is another type of risk, which is financial risk. The risk of financial controls failing, which is our area. Now some of it we've already done, such as treasury risk. We've talked about exchange rates and hedging and so on. Lack of counterparty and credit assessment. We do a little bit of it now in this topic, but counterparty would be where you have insurance and other things that you use. Fraud and its control. I mentioned the book of Silverman and Silverman in fraud auditing and forensic accounting, but today's we will do a case study that is all about fraud. Poor receivables and inventory management. I've talked about that, especially its usefulness in our lean enterprises, that if you do this, cycle times are reduced. It will reduce the financing and other costs. We've talked about that in great detail. Now, last two, systemic failure is when your systems start failing one at a time. In human beings, it may be the liver that goes first, and then it may be the kidneys, and finally the heart, and so on. Systemic failure. In companies, this could be, first of all, a small thing might go wrong, like your in an airline, your booking system, but that leads to problems in the checking in, that leads to problems in flight scheduling, and slowly you find the airline is grounded and no more. So systemic failure, and ultimate systemic failure, if not arrested, is corporate collapse or death. Okay, so let us consider now corporate radar and early warning systems available to reduce the likelihood of financial risk. So if you remember my MBA plus, we've done strategy, marketing, international business, economics, or human resource management, etc., and finance lastly. This is the topic that we are going to use, financial accounting. Now you know that I'm a complete skeptic of IFRS, okay, but here there may be some usefulness in financial accounting numbers, especially for in the area of risk reduction. So we are going to look at this. Okay, so I'm going to talk about, first of all, taking your company to the doctor every week. Just like your blood sugar and cholesterol that the doctor looks at, we are going to look at 9 things on a weekly basis. Whatever the state of the economy, it is critical to have systems in place that give you early warning of trouble spots in your operations. Without such system, you're walking in very dangerous territory. Anticipating the key word here, and with proper monitoring, you'll be in a much better position to head out trouble before it develops. For convenience, we have looked at these areas into 3 groups: finance, marketing, and the supply chain. The idea is to update each one weekly so that you can spot trends as soon as they begin to creep into your operations. So let's look at, by that way, you'll be looking at graphical representations to get a quick visual idea of how things are going. You may find that setting up a series of graphs is your best bet. Then you need to take no more than 10 to 15 minutes a week to get a clear picture of your company's progress, problems, and prospects. So here's an example of a graphical representation. This is a ratio I'm going to look at called the conversion ratio. Okay, you can see that it can go up and down, but when you put it on a graph, you can see the trend. So I showed you how we did these sorts of things on a single graph, on a single piece of paper, all these different graphs. And Excel, this is pretty straightforward. So these are the sort of information that your bookkeeper can easily track and have on your desk every Monday morning, so as not to spoil your weekend. Of course, in Dubai, it will be every Sunday morning. Okay, if you think the numbers are going to be good, have it available on Thursday evening. then you can have a good week. Okay, so let's start with the financial. I think I mentioned this to you already, but when people ask you, how are you? They don't really want to know about your family life and your job and so on. They want to know if you have money. That's basically. Okay. I don't know if this is true or not, but the typical Indian response is, what's your name? Okay. I think, what's your name and what's your job? And the third question is, how much money do you make? Okay. So that's the sort of thing people want to know. Do you have money? So same with the company. Cash on hand. Cash is the company's lifeblood. You can be drowning in orders, but at the same time experiencing a deteriorating cash position. You can have an order book full, but no money to pay your staff. A downward trend in cash can be the sign of any number of potential problems, including stretching out of receivables, so your debtors are taking longer to pay you. Your debtors. A drop in sales orders, the salesmen are not selling enough. Crumbling sales performance, inability to fill orders. You're getting the order, but you do not have the ability for reasons to fill those orders. So you will see when I'm looking at marketing and supply chain, you will be looking at some of these things. All of these come from cash. The first sign of trouble in your cash accounts, you'll want to check your receivables, sales orders, which is the same as invoices, and turnaround times. It's enabled you to pinpoint the source of the problem. Often the day you run out of cash to meet your payroll is not the day you can expect your banker to be sympathetic. Okay? Look, bankers are there. There are a couple of bankers here. Bankers are there to give you money. That's their business, to give you money. But you must make it easy for them to give the money. If you go suddenly on the last day and ask for money, they're not going to give it to you. But if you make a good enough case 3 months before with proper spreadsheet that look convincing, you will get the money. Right? So if you are able to anticipate cash needs, you find that chance of increasing your credit will improve. Upward trends in cash that are traceable to seasonal factors may mean that it's time to consider expanding your operations. Now, just as a matter of interest, in Dubai, I was speaking to some entrepreneurs who started businesses here. They tell me that it's extremely difficult to get a loan in Dubai for a new business. You have to have a track record of at least 2 years before you get a loan. If you have a successful track record for 2 years, you don't need a loan anymore. Okay, so it's a crazy situation. While in America, the whole of America runs on venture capital. You have a good idea, you take it to a venture capitalist, and they will finance you, and they have a certain success rate, failure rate, okay, that they know. So it's the system here is geared towards not entrepreneurship at all. It's an unfortunate thing. Unless you are financed by a family that has a lot of cash, you don't have to need to go to a bank, then it's a problem over here. I don't know how you're going to fix it, but it does not give you people do not make people entrepreneurs. Okay, next one is expenses. Rising expenses usually go hand in hand with rising sales. However, expenses often keep mounting even after sales have begun to taper off. It is important then in your weekly checkup to compare expenses against sales orders. So let's look at that one. I can't remember where this. Here it is. Okay, so if you remember this DuPont ratio tree, I have expenses against sales as one of the ratios. So expenses are in dollars, sales are in dollars. But that is not, and I repeat, not what I'm talking about here. Over here I'm talking about expenses in dollars against the number of sales orders. So this is a cost per cost driver. Okay. Now you might say, but that is really absurd because one of the sales orders is for a $10 item and the next one is for a $10,000 item. How can you add them? Well, it doesn't matter. There will be averaging out. We're going to see the trend, the averages. So just, you can do this as well, but what I'm talking about is a cost driver. If expenses are still on their way up, while sales orders are leveling, you know that it's time to do some belt tightening or at least hold back on further expansion. That is expenses. The next one is receivables. So we are going to look at this accounts receivable area. Okay. Lengthening of receivables is an insidious problem in many small companies. So people are taking longer and longer to pay your debtors. Because you're likely to be preoccupied with a dozen of other pressing problems, you can get caught off guard by customers who gradually take longer to pay their bills and thereby rob you of cash. So if your receivables are growing, you will note that it's going to cost you money. And often, profitable products might turn unprofitable because of the length of time to receive the money. To make sure you have adequate warning, you will want to follow 3 trends. A weekly receivables for 30 to fewer days, trend 30 to 60 days, and for more than 60 days. Okay, now in all, even the smallest accounting package, there's an age analysis of debtors, which is not a problem. The problem is to collect the money. Okay. So when you phone a company and ask for the money, they say the check is in the mail. These days that is reduced because of the direct debit, but even so they say, I will be sending you by direct debit, but they never do so. So most Australian companies now have specialized couriers. They say, don't send by direct debit, don't send by check. We will send our courier to collect the check. And they will be coming to your office at this time. So these are specialist people to collect the money. There are other companies that have a sticker system. If you are late a little bit, there is a sticker, a smiley face is put on the monthly statement. Have you, by the way, forgot to pay your bill? When it's smiling face. If it is 60 days, the face becomes a little bit more straight. Please pay your bill. And for 90 days, different sticker. We are going to send this over to the legal department, and you are going to start paying interest on this amount from now on. That sort of thing. So, collection of receivables. And the last, that's the 3 in finance. Next one is marketing. One of the most important things in marketing is customer inquiries. Customer inquiries is a good measure of how successful your company is promoting, advertising, selling. It is surprising that many companies don't tally them. This is a matter of interest. How many of your companies track customer inquiries? Okay. That is every time a customer contacts you, phones you, faxes you. Even for example, Wisdom, if people ring them to ask about the CMA program, I think they keep track of that particular call, so that's the customer inquiry. Like that. What about you all do that? CRM system is there, that's where the CRM system comes in. So a few people here do that, but it's really powerful if you can keep this information. For service companies in particular, the number of inquiries is an important gauge of future business. For example, interior design company or personal agents will be overworked in current projects or clients, but may still face a sales decline if it is continually attracting new prospects. The next one is sales orders. It is easy enough to forget how vital new orders are. So remember that all the 3 finance things are in the accounting system. Customer inquiries is not, but sales orders is. Because if you don't have sales orders, you can at least have sales invoices. Especially if you are a manufacturer with accumulated backlogs or a service company in the midst of long-term projects. A weekly update forces you to pay some attention. A sharper than expected rise in orders means that you should consider stepping up operations to meet the demand and counter potential backlog problems. A leveling off or decline may be either your first hit at an industry slump or recession is on the way, or it could signal you to take a hard look at your company's sales effort. So it could be that your salesmen are not doing a proper job, but it could be some other reason. Now in Australia we had a company called Jennings Industries that were making what we call spec houses, specification houses. It is the same house over and over again that they go and buy land and build, and they sell it quite cheap. So there was a section that was buying the land and building, and another section marketing. The two were not talking to each other, so what happened was the sales orders went down, but the production didn't know they were buying land and building, and suddenly they had an oversupply of inventory. What was happening was that the market had gone into recession, and had sales been telling them enough about this leveling of sales orders, they would have not got caught with all this inventory. This company went from 80% market share, they almost went broke, and now they have about less than 5% market share of this business. Okay, so very, very important to keep track of this. Now if you have the inquiries, you will have in your accounting system sales orders and invoices, then you can do this most useful ratio for the conversion ratio. So you have to have inquiries for this. The conversion ratio, which is sales orders or contract divided by inquiries, measures your effectiveness in converting inquiries into sales. Decline the ratio can mean your promotion efforts have been directed at the wrong market. So what is happening? You are promoting, you are sending a message across in various formats. People are phoning you to ask about your product, but then they find that it is really not for them. So your promotion is targeting the wrong market. That could be one reason. Or it may be targeting the right market, but your sales force isn't strong enough to close on. So it could be a pull problem or a push problem. Okay, the right people are coming, but your sales force is not closing the deal. If the quality of inquiries improves or the sales force does a better job, it will show up as a rising trend on the conversion graph. Now, one of the great things about the conversion ratio, it tells you if it's a pull problem or a push problem. So check both variables. The conversion ratio is a significant barometer of future prospects and should be checked against both inquiries and sales orders. If inquiries is increasing, at the same time the ratio is falling, so the conversion ratio is falling, but the inquiries is going up. Prospects aren't being converted to customers at earlier rates. So it means trouble in inquiries should decline. So your sales force is not doing a good enough job. Okay, this is happening. On the other hand, the conversion ratio increases, the sales orders remain the same or it decreases, the chances are your company isn't getting the message out about its product or service. You will do well to pick up your marketing efforts. So here salesman, here marketing. So push, pull. Very, very powerful ratio, at least to give you an indication where the problem is. I urge you, I don't know if your type of business is useful for this, but if you are having a business which is more than a couple of customers, key customers that are connected all the time, it is to do with more people phoning you, then you should keep track of your inquiries. Okay, so that is the 3 marketing. Lastly, it is the supply chain. First one is turnaround time. Most companies don't bother to monitor turnaround time or cycle time. Now remember this one because you have dates in your accounting system. When you receive the goods, when you sent out the goods for finished goods, when you sold them, all of that, you can calculate cycle time. This is the average amount of time from when sales orders are written to when they are shipped or completed. A rising trend can spell trouble ahead. As sales orders go in, there is no better way to alienate customers than to take too long to fill the orders. Also, the cost of production is directly related to the length of turnaround time. When turnaround time increases, both wages and material costs per item are likely to rise. This means potentially profitable sales can turn into losses. So you can see as the turnaround time increases, it's going to cost you more money. For service companies, if it is taking longer and longer to complete projects, the problem may lie in managing the people who are fulfilling contracts. Okay, you find that if you are say computer programming company that goes out and does projects, or an audit firm, you might find that it's taking longer and longer to complete these jobs or audits, It may be simply a management of people problem that's causing increasing cost for your company. For manufacturing companies, an extended turnaround time may signal trouble in managing the production areas. Next is backlog. When orders are simply coming in faster than your staff can handle them, you have a potential problem. Irate customers and cancelled orders in your hand. However, by charting the average number of unfilled orders on a weekly basis, you'll be able to spot the rising backlog early enough to make whatever adjustments necessary. For example, a Chicago training company has dealt with this backlog problem by helping one trainer who is not fully booked on staff. The company can handle new orders, keep his backlog in check, and preserve customer goodwill. This is an interesting method. I mean, look at this one. Normally, when you get a customer, we service the first customer before we service the second customer. So, normally most companies do first in, first out. First customer gets service first. But if the first customer gets into a slight amount of backlog, every customer gets into backlog. So what this does is, it puts aside the first customer who got into backlog to a side and looks at the second customer on time. Of course, this means that the first customer may be very angry with you, but it is better to have a few customers very angry with you than all your customers a little angry with you. So that is what this is. Now this happens in airlines. I was going to go to Toronto to give a CMA program from Boston. I went very early in the morning. Air Canada has at least 20 flights a day from Boston to Toronto. And they said my flight was cancelled. So I thought, no problem, I'll get on the next flight. No, I got on about the afternoon flight. Luckily my program was starting the next day. Because they were handling the people who came on time to the flights that were flying. And then they sent me off if there was a seat available. So I was so angry that time, but I now use it as a teaching experience. Okay, so think about that method. Finally, time required to receive ordered items. So here you are looking at your suppliers. Another category that often goes unmonitored. Once again, remember that you can basically have this information in your accounting system. The amount of time between placing purchase orders for supplies and receiving the goods. If your turnaround time is rising, it could be because the key supplier is falling behind on deliveries. By monitoring average delivery time of your main suppliers, you may discover that supplier is having its own problems and you are being hurt as a result. If that's the case, you will at least know what's causing the delays and you can explore other ways to get your suppliers when you need them. Okay, so just 9 things, of which one, custom inquiries is not in the accounting system. Of course, that leads to the conversion ratio. But a challenge to you, large companies or small, is to do this. Monitor these 9 things on a weekly basis and have a graphical representation. This is like going to the doctor for a 6-month checkup, even if you're feeling okay. Right. Any questions up to now? Now let's look at the next stage. What if you are now having a situation where you are feeling not well and you go to the doctor, you hope the news will be good, he's going to put some very serious tests on you. But of course, if the news is bad, it's possible that the end result is death. So here is predictors of corporate failure. Now what we're going to look at is trying to keep our finances from the brink of disaster. We're going to use something called the Z-score. As a matter of interest, how many of you have come across the Z-score or Z-score? Do you have one? Any others? Okay, that's good that it's one, because I hope that you will learn something with this one. Very, very powerful, and once again, this is one thing I'm going to get you to do for your own company tomorrow. And once again, if the news is bad, think about your CV. So originally developed to determine the likelihood of bankruptcy, we can look at it as a measure of overall financial performance. Now, if you look at the DuPont ratio tree, if I was to give you the same accounts, let us say for Etisalat, same accounts to all your groups, and ask you all to do an evaluation of how the company is performing, all of you will have a different answer. Some will say the profitability is good but the liquidity is not so good. Others will say the costs are uncontrolled but leverage ratio gearing is problematic, and so on. So when you look at ratios one at a time, this is called univariate analysis, one variable at a time. It is difficult to get the same answer with the same set of accounts when different people are analyzing. So what was needed was a financial model that summarizes one general aspect of overall company performance. This was the Z-score. Developed to measure the likelihood of bankruptcy, as I told you. It can be used to measure overall financial performance. So here is the DuPont ratio tree that you see before. Now the original Z-score was done by a person called Edward Altman at New York University at Stern, same university that Damodaran is in. By the way, Damodaran is in India, right? Altman has just retired, so he's still not dead. Okay, he just retired from New York University. Okay, he was a PhD student when he did this. Then he became a professor and a world-renowned figure. So in the mid-1960s, when he was doing his PhD, he created this Z-score model. Now, what is good about learning about this model from the 1960s is that it has stood the test of time. So we have learned a lot of models from Ansoff to ABC that are pretty old, okay, but still very relevant today. This one, older the better, like good wine, older the better. Okay, so then we will test this out now. So what did Altman do? He looked at the DuPont ratio tree and picked out 22 ratios, and then he did try to combine these in such a way so he could discriminate between bankrupt and non-bankrupt firms. So this is called discriminant analysis. Okay, discriminant analysis, because it is separating out the good from the bad and so on. So let's look at what this is. Okay, so if you take a group of people and you say separate out girls on one side, boys on one side, that's a discriminant analysis. Blacks on one side, whites on one side, and so on. In this case, he used this model to separate out the okay companies from the failed companies. Model to do that separation. This is called discriminant analysis. Okay, so later he created a 4-variable version. So first of all, he found that 5 of the 22 can do the separation. Later he did a 4-variable version. We start with the 4-variable version because it is good for both public and private firms and for both manufacturers and service companies. So many of the firms that are represented here can be covered by this, except finance companies and banks. Okay, so what are the 4 ratios? X1, X2, X3, X4. Working capital to total assets, retained earnings to total assets, EB to total assets, and net worth to total liability. So you see that total assets comes 3 times in 3 of the ratios. So what he did was he multiplied the individual ratios by these numbers: 6.56, 3.26, and so on. These are called coefficients. Now obviously you must be asking why 6.56, why not 7.57, and so on. I'll explain that later, but you have to multiply by these numbers. Doesn't matter if it is Etisalat or whatever other company here. This can be the individual company, but all must be multiplied by these numbers. Okay. So if you have a figure of 2.6 or more, you are okay. If you get a number 1.1 or below, you are sure to fail. in between 1.1 and 2.6, he said was the gray area. So you might get say 1.2 and you may get okay. You might get 2.5, which is higher than 1.2, but you might face it can go either direction. Okay, so that was the gray area, but anything above 2.6 is okay, and 1.1 you fail. He also calculated some means for these ratios. These are the mean scores of the companies that had failed, and these are the mean scores of companies that were okay. He found that the non-bankrupt firms had an average of 7.7. So even though you're okay if you get more than 2.6, on average the good companies had a ratio is score 7.7, and the failed companies had an average of minus 4.06. Okay, so what is this coefficient? What exactly, how did he calculate this coefficient? Now what Altman did was, he had the information about all companies and their financial records from 1920 to 1960 when he did this study. Okay. He knew what companies had failed and what companies were okay, and he was doing a sort of trial and error to get this separation. So this is not unlike reading the palm, okay, that some people wanted me to do yesterday. Okay, how did palm history come about? Well, they took palm prints of people and they looked at the palms and they found that all the old guys had this line very long, so that must be the lifeline. Okay, and certain lines here, high head line, heart line was also depicted, and but most interesting were the lines on the side here, which told you about your boyfriends, girlfriends, mistresses, toy boys, and so on. Okay, so basically what Altman did was no different. It is called pattern matching. Looking at the past, asking interviews, and then looking to see if there are any commonalities. So he did it, of course, using a computer. He did it using a System 360 computer in 1960. And he was basically trying out different numbers, basically trial and error. So the urban legend is that the rocket scientists who were trying to send a rocket to the moon in 1969 were complaining about this PhD student who was cannibalizing all the computer storage and memory. Remember that those computers there, those mainframes are less powerful than these laptops. Okay, so that's what he did. Basically, he found that these numbers by trial and error were the best numbers, the best separation. You can't use anything else. You can't use anything else if you are using Altman's cutoff scores. Any questions up to now? Yes.
This number is for all sectors and industry, or after that it comes for
every industry, every company, no matter what industry, if it is in service or manufacturing, you have to use those numbers. Later on I'll talk about industry specific models, but this is the basic model. Okay. Any other questions? Yeah, this ratio multiplied by this gives you, and then you add it up and you have to look at the answers. Okay, so the first ratio is working capital total assets. You can see this is looking at your liquidity. So let's look at the liquidity ratio here. The average for non-bankrupt was 41%, so 41% of total assets is working capital. Bankrupt has gone negative. That means current liabilities is more than current assets. Okay. Next one is cumulative profitability. This is the retained earnings figure for the balance sheet. Okay. To some degree, the ratio reflects the age of your company, because young people, the rest of it has had to raise cumulative profits. It bias in favor of older firms is not surprising in the high failure rate of young companies. Okay, so usually just like products, younger the company, most likely it is going to fail. Okay, now the failure of companies within 5 years is some research indicates about 80%. I think that is a little bit high in that many companies that register never actually operate and then they close down. But still, if it is 60%, 70%, that's quite high. And you will see that the average is that 35.5% of your total assets, of course remember that same as your total capital, is reserves, retained earnings. But for a bankrupt company, your retained losses is more than that, it's minus. Next one, EBIT to total asset, that's your typical profitability ratio. Okay, and look at the averages. Bankrupt, not bankrupt, 15.4%. So even though he was using 1920 to 1960 companies, 15.4% of return on assets is about the number that we expect even today as an average. When it's bankrupt, it went EBIT was negative. And finally, the net worth to total liability. Now, net worth is equity, and total liabilities is your debt. So this is the inverse of the more familiar debt to equity ratio. We have been doing debt which is B upon share which is S, the BS ratio. This is the inverse of it. Okay, so if you look at the diagram that I drew here, you will see that higher the level of debt, there is liquidation, bankruptcy risk coming in. So if you look over here at the averages, those that were okay had twice as much equity as debt. Those that were bankrupt had half as much equity as debt. So the liquidation risk of high gearing is clearly shown in Altman's averages. Yes.
Given more weightage, the
Assets.
assets and the current period, this is earnings before interest and tax
No,
and
the only-
working capital. It's like a weightage. He's given a weightage for all these things.
You mean you're talking about these numbers here? Yeah, so that's the way it worked out. Yes.
It looks so short term.
Why is it short term?
He's giving the
When all of those are current.
No, retained earnings.
Yeah.
Is a period of time.
So retained earnings over a period of time.
But this
Okay.
earnings before interest taxes for a particular period.
Yes.
And then working capital.
So but assets is also over a period of time. Assets you build up over a period of time. Working capital you build up over a period of time. Okay, the only thing from the income statement that is an annual amount is your EBIT. So that argument is not correct. Okay, so let us do an example now of the BC Corporation. This is the balance sheet. So from the balance sheet, you know the number that you need. You can look at your own balance sheet now. We are going to take total assets. We are going to take current assets minus current liabilities. Okay, current liabilities over here. We are going to take retained earnings. We are going to take the net worth and the total liabilities figure. From the income statement, the only figure that we take is your EBIT. That is the annual figure. Now in the 4 variable version, the stock data is not used. That is the share price, because this is even for a private company. But in the 5 variable version, the one you need first, we need share value, and I'll show that in a little while. Okay, so have a look at the numbers now. Okay, here are the 4 ratios. For this company, the ratios turn out like this. Current asset minus current liabilities upon total assets. Remember, total asset comes 3 times. Retained earnings, EBIT from the income statement, and net worth, which is equity, upon total liabilities, which is debt. So these are the ratios. So you can do the same thing for say HSLR. You get the results there. And then you multiply it by these numbers and only these numbers, nothing else. You get the score individually and you add it up, you get 5.2. Now before we discuss this number, please note the balance sheet that we used, right? When I started on the first day, I drew a balance sheet like this, and I put current liabilities on this side as working capital. But Altman had current liabilities on the financing side. Okay, you can see Altman had his current liabilities over there. So if you are doing Altman ZSCO, do not use this model for the balance sheet. You must set it up like Altman did, in this manner, with the current liabilities on the financing side. Otherwise, you can't use his model or his cutoffs. So remember that. Okay. Right. So the answer is 5.2. So what do you think about this number? What do you think about the number? Let's look at the cutoff scores. What do you think? Doing well? Any other views? So if I was the company and I went to the doctor, would the doctor say good or bad? No, the doctor is going to scold me. The doctor is going to scold me. Why? Because I won't die. I am not 2.6, I won't die, but I am unfit. Average is 7.7, this is only 5.2. So he is going to say, Prof, you are unfit, you need to exercise and go on a diet, because if you don't do it, and this may go down until the point where we can't recover you. So it's not good. He's going to scold you, as my doctor always does. Okay. You are unfit.
The reality is he's making business.
No, he does my blood sugar and cholesterol, and if he gets this number, he's going to score.
I think X4 is a little low due to the liabilities is almost near to the
X4, look, don't look at, we will later on look at the ratios individually, okay, because we try to find out what is driving this down. But for the moment, the overall score is what we're looking at. Okay. Right, so remember, unfit. Z-score is the analytical tool. Z-score is a good analytical tool no matter what shape your company is in. Even if your company is very healthy, if your Z-score begins to fall sharply, warning they should ring. If your company is barely surviving, then you can use the Z-score to help evaluate the projected efforts of your turnaround efforts. So here you will look at the individual ratios. Examine now the financial statement. So now you can go and look at your individual ratios, which is your DuPont ratio 3. Look at your individual ratios over here. The purpose of calculating your own Z-score is to warn your financial problems that may need serious attention and provide a guide for action. If your Z-score is lower than you like, then you should examine your financial statements to determine the reason why. Now do a individual ratio analysis, looking at the problem areas. So in your case that I'm going to give you after lunch, you'll be looking first at the Z-score and then at the individual financial ratios, and then I'll tell you to do something more than that. Start by calculating the scores from previous periods, comparing them with your own score. If the trend is down, try to understand what has changed to create ratios that are dragging your scores down. So you are going to do inter-firm comparisons. Another way to analyze the score is to compare your results with those of other companies, not only the past of your own company, but look at other companies. So I'm going to show you the figure. If you can't find your competitor ratios through some commercial source, you can at least use Altman's figures. Compare this ratio with your own, and you can also compare your own calculation with industry ratios and find the ones that are out of line. So you can look at your own ratios against Altman's averages. Now, remember I told you you started with 22 ratios, and later on in your notes I have given you the averages for those 22. So you have far more than just 4. Now the interesting thing is there is no market for excuses. So when I go to the doctor and he tells me, Prof, you have to go on a diet, okay, you are unfit and so on, I come up with excuses. I say, but you know, I travel so many people, nice students take me out for dinner and this and that, and the hotel food is different, and so on. I give excuses and finally say, okay, go. Right? But in the case of the Z-score, no excuses. Very stern. When you make this comparison, it's very natural to excuse low ratio by saying we are different. The purpose example, suppose for example your X3 ratio is lower than your industry average, you might say we made a much greater investment in production equipment than our competitors, giving us the advantage. But if this additional investment provides a truly competitive advantage, the other ratio should more than compensate for the low X3 ratio. X3 is your profitability ratio. If not, your competitors may actually have the advantage because they are able to achieve similar profits with a small investment in assets and correspondingly smaller debt. Now this is exactly the excuse that Coca-Cola in Melbourne gave. They say we have put all this latest equipment in, our EBIT is low at the moment, but we have this advantage, but then the competitors are getting better profitability with less assets. So it is very, very stern. Okay, so moving from analysis to action. The Z-score you soon learn takes a very stern view of your financial statements. Z-score, profits are good, assets are bad. Now profits is good, we can understand. What does it mean assets are bad? What it means is marginal, non-productive assets are bad. Remember the Roxor case with all that land that was not producing. That's what we're talking about. Liabilities are worse, but worst of all is current liability, because an unhappy creditor can put you into bankruptcy. If your Z-score is lower than you would like, can improve it considerably by selling marginal assets and using the cash to reduce current liabilities. This will improve ratio X1 by increasing working capital and decreasing assets, ratios X2 and X3 by reducing assets, and ratio X4 by reducing liabilities. Now in the real world this makes perfect sense. Reducing current liabilities often lowers interest costs and reduces the possibility of an unhappy creditor forcing you into bankruptcy. Reducing assets often lowers the overhead costs and improves your return on assets invested in your company. Okay, so remember that Z-score is but one of the analytical tools that are available to you. Since Altman's work, hundreds, probably thousands of academics have developed their own Z-score. Okay. There are Z-scores for countries, maybe there are Z-scores for the Middle East, GCC countries and so on. But what I have given you is the Z-scores available to be given to you, because most people who develop these make money out of it. They tell you, give us your account and we will put it through a Z-score model and give you the results. But they don't give you the coefficients and so on, because that's what they make money on. I had a colleague of mine at Melbourne University long years ago called Merv Lincoln. He did his PhD on Australian companies, and he did something called the L score, L for Lincoln. Then he left the university, set up his own consultancy, and today his son has taken over. It's called Lincoln Indicators. So when I met him, I said, Merv, I know what your coefficients are because it's in your PhD at the university. He said, no, those are not the correct ones, and I have since them upgraded, and so you don't know. Okay. So what you have is those that have been given for public consumption. Bank asset classification models, the Z-score models, are by no means infallible. They can provide valuable warnings of trouble and be useful guides to ways of avoiding trouble ahead. They can complement other reports and analysis that you use within the company. Seldom, however, should you use any of the models as your only means of financial analysis. So we are going to start with the Z score, but we are going to also do other analyses as I will show you even in the case study. Okay, now I'm sure you must be asking a question, how valuable is it? Let's look at this now. The original Z score was developed in 1968, and you can see that it requires a market value, so you need a listed company. So instead of book value of equity and book value of debt, it uses market value, and it uses another ratio, says the total assets. You can see the coefficients are very different, and the cutoff scores, however, are similar but not exact. 2.7 which is 2.9 instead of 2.6, and 1.8 instead of 1.1 as cutoff scores. Now later on, 10 years later, an English academic called Tafler, Richard Tafler, came out with a formula that allowed us to look at for English companies. So Tafler is very, very different to Altman. While Altman is very much security oriented with so many assets calculation, this is very much liquidity oriented. And you can see that the coefficients are different, the ratios are different, and the cutoffs are different. The cutoff here is anything in excess of 0.2, and certainly 0.2 is okay. Below 0.2 and certainly below 0, the company is going to fail. Okay, now in the case study that I'm going to give you, the Maxwell company is an English company. So I will get you all to use Tafler. First of all, because Tafler is English, and the other one is because that particular case study does not have retained earnings. So you can't use Altman anyway. Okay, so we will use it Tafler. Okay, then how valuable is this? Now, a person called Inman studied 6 companies in the UK in the 1990s. So remember, Altman is 1960, Tafler is 1970. This was end of 1980, 1990. He studied 6 companies where there was a failure event, subsidiary sold, receivers appointed, administrators appointed, shares suspended, taken over, etc. He calculated the Altman score and the Tafler score. These are the 5 variable version. Now I don't have the original data, so we'll assume that he's done the calculations correctly. You can see that basically between the two, the only one that had an okay result, it's just okay, was Federated Housing. Board didn't pick it. So what happened to Federated Housing? Federated Housing was essentially a fraud. Shares suspended, receiver called in. So you can't expect Altman or Tafler to pick fraudulent accounts. But still it was not bad, it got it close. Barton was okay for Altman, although it slipped into the problem area here. Okay. You can see suspect, both got legislacy is very risky, and so on. So between the two, not bad at picking the problem, despite with Altman is concerned 30 years later. So duration of warning, some of these had to 2.5 years warning for Tafler, some with the gray area for Altman, and so on. You can turn a company around, okay, with these sorts of warnings. Okay, now what about the 2000s? This is a study that I did with another professor. Altman in the 2000s. The spectacular collapses on the world stage have brought about much debate on issues of overly creative and often fraudulent accounting and lack of corporate governance procedures. Let us analyze if the Altman Z score based on USA data from 1920 to 1960 was still applicable in the 2000s. So what I'm going to do, what we did was we looked at the biggest collapses at that time in the US, which everyone knows, Enron and WorldCom. So USA companies with USA data, But we also checked the two biggest collapses in Australia, Ansett Airlines and OneTel, a telephone company. So we are going to check Australian companies against USA scores. Okay, now you'll be surprised at the numbers. Now we didn't pick these companies to suit our benefit, we picked these companies because they were the biggest. Okay, biggest failures. Look at this. Or Ansett, during crisis year, bankrupt. Enron, bankrupt. OneTel in the grey area, and WorldCom grey area. So what was the surprise? Why were these surprises? Why was Enron such a surprise? Why was WorldCom such a surprise when it collapsed? It was ZESCO was picking it. Were no auditors doing this? Were no CFAs from the London Stock Exchange or American Stock Exchange doing any calculation of ZESCOs? The Australian auditing standards for at least the last 30 years has said when you're doing the going concern test, use Altman's ZESCO. But looks like auditors never used it. Didn't even know what it was. Okay, pretty bad. Pretty bad means that they should have picked these problems and saved their investors money. Look at the financial ratios. I won't go through it in detail, but remember I told you I'll give you the averages of the 22 ratio. These are the averages. If you go through it carefully, you will see in fact that even under the univariate analysis, when you compare it against Altman's ratios, these companies are doing badly. Leverage ratios, activity ratios, volatility ratios, and so on. But the biggest one was the last test that we did. We tested it against the SVA model that we did before the break. Remember the Rappaport case? Look at this. Now when Ansett collapsed, it actually went into suspension and government promised it was okay, but they took the shares away. So it was not listed at that time. Okay, when it collapsed, but the free cash flow model said it was worth $7.49 and the net tangible assets of the book value was $42. Okay, so keep that aside, let's look at the three that we have the share price. Look at this. Now remember that all three have got a bad rating from Altman now. Look at this. Market price was $65, free cash flow model $20. OneTel, market price 47 cents, free cash flow model 7 cents. WorldCom, market price $15, free cash flow model $3. No wonder it collapsed. Okay, the market values are highly inflated at that time compared to their cash flow model here, and then of course we have the ZESCO. Okay, so what was the big surprise? Okay, why were the CFAs, certified financial analysts, not doing their work and helping their clients? Simple calculations, not done. Okay, so these tests that you should do, start with your own company, and before you do any investments, do these tests. Now the value of failure predictors, as I told you, they are not infallible. There are misclassifications. There is what is called type 1 and type 2 error. Luckily for us, the exact scores are more on the type 1 error. That is, they tell a company is going to fail and it doesn't fail. That's a type 1 error, that's okay. But the worst one is the type 2 error where they say the company is not going to fail and it fails. The doctor says you're perfectly healthy, go home and you die overnight. That is a type 2 error. That is more problematic. Okay? So there have been misclassifications even in this Inman study, but not overwhelmingly bad. Altman said, when I was giving one of the early sessions in Dubai, probably in about 2007 or 8, I was telling them that Altman had just put out a prediction that both General Motors and Ford is going to fail. Now when Altman says something, people listen. Right? This was well before the GFC. And actually both should have failed. Ford was rescued by, I don't know, some sort of creative thing, but General Motors did fail and had to be split into two. So when Altman said General Motors and Ford, America's big companies are going to fail, that the whole market listened. And that is exactly what is showing up in the results. Okay, so that is the so now before we go for lunch, I just want to give you a quick recap of the case study that you're going to come back and do. Right? This is the Maxwell case study. Don't read it at the moment, I'll just give you what it is. Maxwell was the true James Bond of the corporate world. Robert Maxwell. He was an army officer in World War II, and he managed to convince MI6, the same organization that James Bond works for, to give him a loan to start a book translation company called Pergamon Press. That was the official reason. The actual reason was he wanted to get Russian scientist secrets, okay, across to the West. And MI6 financed him. After the war, he continued to run that operation. MI6 never asked for the money back. So Pergamon Press was there. Then he got into all sorts of odd dealings, and he went bankrupt in the 1950s and maybe early 60s. Okay. In fact, there was a report that he should not ever be a director again, but after some time you can come back as a director. He came back with force, formed Maxwell Communication Corporation, and he was the darling of the market in England. In fact, Credit Lyonnais and the Midlands Bank gave him £2.1 billion sterling, not million, billion, in the 1980s for his business, okay, for leverage buying. So everything seemed to be going well, and then suddenly one day he went out on a yacht and he fell overboard and died. Okay, about 2 days later they found a body, and then it was found out that he sort of fell overboard in the evening, but that day the first bank had pulled the plug on him to return loans, and it was found that he was heavily into debt, and that first bank putting the plug meant a domino effect of all the banks wanting the money back. So he died, and then the shares were suspended. There was some issues about fraud. Okay, his children he had 2 children also working in the company, 2 boys. They were questioned and taken to jail. All of these sorts of things happened. So what we are going to look at is the companies and reports up to the point, the annual report before he died. And if a simple financial analysis enabled us to see the problem, that we don't have to wait until the man goes overboard and dies. Okay. Now why is he a true James Bond? Because the body was given a state funeral in Israel. He was a Jew. State funeral in Israel. Why would a businessman from England get a state funeral in Israel? It was because it was later found out that he was working for the Mossad. So MI6 and Mossad. Then when Russian Empire disintegrated, the top of the KGB was questioned about Maxwell, and he said, yes, Robert Maxwell was working for us as well. So not a double agent, but a triple agent. MI6, Mossad and KGB. Okay, who knows, he might have been working for the CIA as well. Now they never saw the body, because a Jewish funeral, you don't see the body. So there's a lot of story that Robert Maxwell never died, that the Mossad took him over, and that he's living with Elvis Presley and Marilyn Monroe somewhere, and maybe Michael Jackson. Okay, that is okay. That there's lots of conspiracy theories, because it is quite a coincidence that he went overboard on the day that the bank pulled the plug. Okay, so that is go and look at Google and look at all the conspiracy theories about Maxwell. But the interesting thing is, could a CFA, chartered accountant, done a simple analysis of the accounts, done a few years scores, and found the company in trouble well before he went overboard. So in your own group, I would recommend that 2 people work on the last year's tax ledger score. Other 3 people work on the financial ratios, again for the last year, the last 2 years. Okay, after lunch, and then we go from there. Okay, so let's take a break. Why don't we come back at 2:30? Okay, 1